The lights are off. The corridors stretch ahead in near complete darkness, lit only by the emergency orange glow of panels that were never meant to be the last light you see. Something is moving inside the vents. The sound it makes is wet and rhythmic, like a body being dragged over rivets. You are alone on a ship the size of a small city, and every piece of it is covered in the remnants of people who tried to survive the same thing you are now facing. On the walls, written in blood so dried it has turned the color of rust, are words. 2 of them, repeated over and over in dozens of handwritings, scrawled by people who stopped being themselves before they were done writing. Make us whole. This is the world of Dead Space. A world where the horror has nothing to do with monsters that appeared from nowhere, where the nightmare was not delivered from outside. The nightmare was already inside. It was inside the ship, inside the people, inside the signal nobody thought to question, inside the grief of one exhausted engineer who loved someone he never properly said goodbye to. Over the next several hours, this video will do something that goes beyond explaining Dead Space's lore. It will analyze why this specific franchise creates psychological dread that survives long after you put down the controller, examining the real science of isolation and madness, the institutional structures that made this horror possible, and the specific way the marker exploits the human mind as a tool, rather than treating it as an obstacle. By the end, you will understand that Dead Space is not a story about an alien invasion. It is a story about how every system designed to protect you, your mind, your love, your government, your faith, can be turned against you by something patient enough to wait. If you enjoy this type of content, please do me a favor and drop a comment below. Let me know what you liked, or throw out a suggestion for the next rabbit hole to explore. Leaving a comment goes a long way to helping others gain new insights on the topics, and I love receiving feedback. So now get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's start. Chapter 1: The Architecture of Dread. There is a concept in environmental psychology called affordance theory. The basic idea is that every space communicates to you what it will allow you to do inside it. A wide open field affords running. A kitchen affords nourishment. A library affords quiet concentration. Every room and corridor gives its inhabitants a set of unconscious instructions about how to behave and what to expect. The USG Ishimura affords dying, not because it was designed that way. The Ishimura was built to be the largest and most capable Planet Cracker-class vessel in the human fleet, a ship capable of literally dismantling an entire planet by dropping massive drill columns through a world's crust, breaking it apart at a geological level, and harvesting the raw mineral wealth that spilled out. The scale of that engineering is almost incomprehensible. This was not a small vessel. This was a mobile industrial city with rotating sections to generate gravity, a crew measured in the hundreds, decks dedicated to medical care, food production, research, security, and the management of the resources being extracted. It was built for efficiency and long-term habitation. Its designers thought about everything. They did not think about the marker. When Isaac Clarke first steps aboard the Ishimura, the game gives you something that most horror experiences skip entirely. It gives you a moment of normalcy before the floor falls out. The docking bay is quiet. The lights are mostly on. The ship looks like exactly what it was designed to be. Something is clearly wrong. There are signs of struggle, of hasty abandonment. But the structural logic of the Ishimura is still readable. This is a ship. These are corridors connecting one functional zone to another. The engineering section connects to the medical deck, connects to the bridge. The layout makes sense. You can map it in your head. That readability is the first trap, because as you move deeper into the Ishimura, the game begins dismantling the psychological safety that familiar structure provides. The corridors grow narrower. The lighting systems begin failing in non-uniform ways. The layout that made intuitive sense from the outside begins to feel recursive, labyrinthine, like the ship is folding in on itself. Rooms you remember passing through look different the second time. Sections meant for human occupation are thick with biological growth, the corruption spreading across walls and floors and ceilings, with the slow tenacity of something that has been growing undisturbed for weeks. The corruption deserves more attention than it usually gets. This spreading organic mass is not just a visual element. In the fiction of the game, it is actively hostile. It emits a toxic gas that damages Isaac if he stands in it too long, and it hosts structures that serve the necromorph infestation. But its deeper function is what matters here. It takes every surface that used to communicate safety and belonging. The metal floors meant to support human feet, the walls meant to contain breathable air, the ceilings meant to mark the boundary between habitable space and the void, and covers them in something that has no business being there. It makes the inside of the ship feel like the outside of something alive and predatory. The Ishimura stops being a place humans built and starts feeling like the interior of something that is eating them. This is one of the most effective pieces of environmental horror ever designed in a game. Not because it is grotesque, though it is, because it takes affordance theory and inverts it entirely. Every surface in the Ishimura communicates revised affordances. This corridor affords ambush. This room affords nowhere to hide. This ventilation system affords something coming through it at any moment. The space has been rewritten by the outbreak into a different kind of environment, one optimized, not for human survival, but for human termination. Sound is the other dimension of this. Real spacecraft, even in science fiction, should be extremely quiet. The vacuum of space conducts no sound whatsoever, and a ship with functioning life support systems should insulate its occupants from external noise while providing only the low background hum of machinery doing its work. The Ishimura in a healthy state would have been a quiet place broken only by human voices. The ventilation system, the distant mechanical processes of the planet Cracker assembly. The Ishimura in the game is never quiet. Metal creaks under unexplained pressure. Distant impacts register through the floors without explanation. Ventilation shafts carry sounds that are almost but not quite recognizable. Something between machinery cycling through a malfunction and something organic moving through spaces too tight for what you imagine is making that sound. And underneath all of it, at a level that registers more as physical sensation than auditory information, there is something that resembles breathing. Researchers studying the psychological effects of sound on human fear responses have documented something called the frequency response to infrasound, very low frequency sound waves below the threshold of normal hearing. These frequencies have been documented to cause feelings of unease, disorientation, and even hallucination in human subjects. They cause the eye to vibrate slightly, which can produce visual artifacts that the brain interprets as peripheral motion. A shadow that wasn't there, a shape that disappeared when you looked directly at it. The Ishimura's sound design uses precisely these principles, not because anyone explicitly decided to engineer psychological torture through frequency manipulation, but because the conditions of a failing industrial ship, the pressure differentials, the compromised mechanical systems, the structural stress of a vessel not designed to be stationary relative to a planetary body, naturally produce the exact range of sounds that human neurology finds most threatening. The Ishimura does not need to be haunted to feel haunted. The physics of its situation accomplish that entirely on their own. And then there is the silence of space itself, which Dead Space uses as a genuine narrative tool. When Isaac enters sections where the hull has been breached, where the pressure is too low for atmosphere to remain, the sound drops out completely. The game goes genuinely, completely quiet. You can see necromorphs moving toward you. You can see your own weapons firing. You can see the impacts, the damage, the creature's body responding to what you're doing to it, and you hear none of it. The silence is absolute, and it is wrong in a way that is deeply difficult to articulate, because silence is supposed to feel safe. We seek quiet, we find rest in it. But the silence of vacuum is not the silence of rest. It is the silence of death made into a location. And your body knows the difference, even when your mind is still processing what your eyes are seeing. This is the first mechanism of Dead Space's terror. The environment itself is a psychological weapon, calibrated not by intent but by circumstance to produce maximal dread in a human nervous system. Before any necromorph has appeared, before any lore has been explained, before any emotional stakes have been established, The Ishimura has already done damage, and then the door opens. There is a moment early in the game where Isaac rounds a corner and finds a body. Just a body. A crew member in a standard uniform, sprawled face down on the corridor floor, surrounded by dried blood. And then, as you approach it, it moves. Not in any way a living person moves. Limbs that bend wrong, joints that flex in directions they were never designed to flex. Movement that is fast when it should be slow, and slow when it should be fast. The human body knows, at a level below conscious thought, when another body is moving correctly. It is one of our oldest survival programs, the ability to read motion and categorize it as threat or safe. We evolved this long before we had language. The necromorphs are designed to fail every single one of those pattern recognition checks. What that means, and why it matters for the specific fear Dead Space produces, belongs in the next chapter. Because before we can understand what the necromorphs are, we need to understand the man watching them. Isaac Clarke has been carrying this alone for longer than anyone knew, and the weight of what he brought onto that ship with him was not armor, it was invitation. Chapter 2. A Man Already Broken. There is a specific quality of guilt that comes from the last thing you said to someone before they died. Not regret in the general sense, not the diffuse sadness that comes from losing someone close. The very specific torment of knowing that the final record of your relationship with another person is a moment when you were unkind, when you said something that cannot be taken back because there is no longer anyone to receive the taking back. This form of grief has a psychological weight that is distinct from ordinary mourning. Therapists who specialize in complicated bereavement have documented that unresolved final interactions frequently become the anchor point around which prolonged grief disorder organizes itself. The unfinished conversation becomes a wound that ordinary healing processes cannot close because healing requires some form of resolution, and resolution requires another person who is no longer there to provide it. This is Isaac Clarke before he ever reaches the Ishimura. Isaac's mother, Octavia Clarke, converted to the Church of Unitology. The conversion was not mild or gradual in the way religious conviction sometimes shifts a person's priorities without fundamentally altering their behavior. Octavia's conversion was total and catastrophic. She liquidated the family estate to fund the church's required financial contributions, stripping the Clarke family of the material resources that formed the foundation of what should have been a stable life. She became, in the clinical description that appears in records Isaac later accessed, psychologically deteriorated, her sense of self increasingly subsumed by the church's influence, her reality reshaped around its doctrines to the point where the people who had known her before the conversion reported feeling as though they were speaking to someone wearing her face. Isaac's father took his own life. Octavia, in the grip of her deterioration, then took her own life as well. The Church of Unitology, in the aftermath of this, took both bodies immediately. The Church's protocols around the deaths of members are specific. The remains of Unitologists are processed by the Church according to its own rites, which are not disclosed to non-members and which are not subject to outside interference. Isaac was denied access to his parents' remains. He was denied the location of their burial. He was denied any form of closure that required the physical presence of the people he had lost, any ritual that might have allowed his grief to locate itself in a specific place and time and begin the long process of resolution. This detail matters enormously. Grief research consistently identifies the ability to mark a specific endpoint through burial, through final rites, through the physical acknowledgement that a body has been placed somewhere permanent as one of the key mechanisms by which mourning moves through its stages toward accommodation. When this endpoint is denied, when there is no grave to visit and no ceremony to mark the departure, grief has no anchor. It circulates, it finds nowhere to land, and unanchored grief, over time, becomes something that shapes every subsequent relationship, every subsequent loss, every subsequent experience of being helpless in the face of something larger than the self. Isaac met Nicole Brennan through this grief. She had been Octavia Clarke's neuropsychiatrist, treating his mother during the period of her psychological deterioration. The relationship that developed between them was built, from its foundations on the wreckage of what unitology had done to his family. There is something in that connection that the game never explicitly names, but that runs underneath every interaction Isaac has with Nicole's memory. She was supposed to fix his mother. She was the trained professional who should have been able to prevent the worst of it. And she had failed, or at least Isaac's grief had decided she had failed, and that decision became the raw material for the last thing he ever said to her. Nicole accepted the promotion that sent her to the Ishimura. Isaac, in some accounts, encouraged her to take it, pushed her toward this posting that would carry her months of travel away from him. The specific texture of that encouragement, whether it was genuine support, whether it was a subtle expression of the distance that had grown between them after his parents' deaths, whether it was some combination of both, belongs to the psychological interior of characters the game deliberately leaves partially obscured. What is documented is the video call. Octavia Clarke's death arrived in Isaac's life in the form of a message, while Nicole was already deployed on the Ishimura, already deep in the operation that would become the worst disaster in human history. The timing meant that Isaac's grief had nowhere to go but sideways. He contacted Nicole and he blamed her, angrily and specifically. He told her that she had claimed his mother was well enough to return home when she wasn't, and that she might as well have killed them herself. And then he tried to walk it back. He began to apologize, and Nicole ended the call. She told him to go to hell, and she cut the connection, and that was the last thing Isaac Clarke heard from the woman he loved while she was still alive to say anything. The psychology of what this does to a person is worth dwelling on, not because Dead Space invites you to dwell on it during gameplay. The game moves too quickly and too urgently for that, but because understanding the specific shape of Isaac's psychological wound explains almost everything about why the marker is so devastating to him in particular. The marker, as we will see in detail, is not a random killer. It is a precise instrument. And what precision instruments do is find the exact point of vulnerability and press there, over and over, until the structure fails. Isaac's vulnerability is specific. He cannot resolve what happened with Nicole. He cannot repair the relationship. He cannot deliver the apology. He cannot find out whether she forgave him, whether she understood, whether the last words she heard from him defined what she felt in her final moments. That unresolved conversation is a wound that cannot scar over because scarring requires completion. And this story has no completion available. There is also the layer of guilt that compounds this. Isaac's father's engineering work was the model for Isaac's own career. His mother's instability had shaped his childhood in ways he would have spent years trying to consciously acknowledge and process. The Church of Unitology had taken both his parents and everything they owned, and the grief of that was entangled with a rage that had nowhere legitimate to be directed. That rage had redirected itself, in one terrible moment of pain, at Nicole. He had been trying to reach her reportedly since the falling out, trying to repair the communication, getting no response. And then the Ishimura went dark, and a distress signal reached CEC stations, and a maintenance crew was dispatched to investigate. Isaac was on that crew. He requested it. Stop and sit with that for a moment, because it is one of the most psychologically dense details in the entire franchise. Isaac Clarke did not end up on the Ishimura by accident, by assignment, by the random mechanics of being a CEC engineer in the wrong place at a difficult time. He pushed to be there. He requested the posting. He boarded the USG Kellyan and traveled toward a ship he had no reason to believe was anything other than what the distress signal suggested. A vessel with a serious systems failure, needing emergency maintenance, with the private, unacknowledged hope of finding Nicole, of having the conversation he had been denied, of completing something that had been torn open and left bleeding. He walked into the worst situation in human history because he was trying to fix an argument. Grief does this. This is not unique to Isaac, not a character flaw that marks him as unusually unwise. Psychologists who work with people in acute mourning states document repeatedly that the drive to resolve interrupted relationships can override rational risk assessment in ways that the grieving person often cannot recognize as irrational, because the need feels so legitimate. It feels like love, which it is. It feels like responsibility, which it also is. and it walks you directly into situations that a clearer mind, one not organized around an open wound, would recognize as dangerous. Isaac also carries something else with him aboard the Ishimura that shapes everything that follows: a deep, bone-deep distrust of the Church of Unitology. His mother's conversion destroyed his family. His parents' bodies were taken by the Church and never returned. Every piece of his personal catastrophe has Unitology's fingerprints on it. He boards a ship where, as he will discover, the Unitologist presence among the crew is significant, where Unitologist rites have been conducted in crew quarters and common areas, where the pull of the marker's influence has found particularly fertile ground in the people who had a theological framework for interpreting the whispers as divine communication. This is a man who walks into a crisis already carrying maximum psychological load. He is exhausted from grief. He is carrying guilt he has had no framework for processing. He is driven by an urgency that has bypassed his capacity for rational risk assessment, and he is about to step into the direct influence range of an alien artifact that has spent millennia developing the exact ability to locate psychological wounds and transform them into instruments of control. The video message Nicole sent, the one that opened the game, the one that first told Isaac something was catastrophically wrong aboard the Ishimura, was her final record. It was not a call for help in the normal sense. It was something closer to a document of what she had understood in her last moments, an explanation directed at the person she most needed to explain herself to. And it was waiting for him, on that ship, like something that had been placed there, because, in a sense, it had been. The marker's ability to manipulate Isaac specifically did not begin when he stepped aboard the Ishimura. That is what makes the architecture of this horror so complete. The manipulation began before the ship, before the mission, in the long, specific damage done to Isaac Clarke, in the years before he ever saw the double helix outline of a red marker rising out of a cargo bay. Understanding how requires understanding what the marker actually is, what it actually does, what it was actually built for. But before that, before we go to the science of the necromorphs and the engineering of the marker's signal, there is something you need to hold in your mind, something the game makes you feel before it explains it. When Isaac finally receives Nicole's last message in its entirety, he learns the truth. She was already dead. She had been dead before his ship docked. The video had been waiting for him aboard a vessel full of corpses, recorded by someone who had understood that she was not going to survive and had chosen to leave something behind for the person she couldn't stop thinking about at the end. She takes her own life in that recording, with the specific calm of someone who has found some form of resolution. Isaac did not know this when he arrived. For the entire first game, through every necromorph, every discovery, every desperate repair and system restart and firefight in zero gravity, he is being guided by a voice he believes is Nicole reaching out to him, trying to help him. He is running toward the possibility of the apology still being received. There is no one there to receive it. The horror of Dead Space begins here, not with the monsters, with the man who will spend the entire game running towards something that has already ended. And there is a question hanging over all of it, a question the game plants carefully and answers late and in the wrong way, that you need to keep in the back of your mind as we move forward. If Nicole was dead before Isaac arrived, who was guiding him? What wanted him to keep moving through that ship? What needed him to reach the end? The necromorphs are the surface of this story. What they are, where they came from, and what they reveal about the nature of the threat is the layer beneath that surface. Chapter 3: When the Dead Don't Stay Dead. There is a moment in the philosophy of horror where the theorist Noel Carroll identifies what he calls impurity as the core mechanism of monster fear. The idea is this: the human response to something as monstrous is not purely about the threat it poses, it is about the violation of categories. The things we find most viscerally horrifying are the things that belong to two categories at once. Things that should be one thing, but are also, wrongly, simultaneously something else. The dead thing that moves, the inside thing that is now outside, the familiar shape that holds something alien. Necromorphs are impurity made flesh. They are not alien creatures that have invaded the Ishimura from outside. Every single necromorph is a person who was on that ship. Every grotesque form, every creature that moves in ways that violate the basic grammar of how living bodies move, every enemy that should have been the colleague of someone on the crew, these were people. They had names on the personnel manifest. They had quarters assigned to them, work shifts scheduled, medical records on file. They woke up that morning, if morning means anything on a deep space mining vessel, as recognizably human individuals. The marker's signal does not create these creatures from nothing. It rewrites what is already there. When a person dies within range of a marker's signal, the marker's influence begins restructuring the dead tissue at a cellular level. The genetic instructions are not written by any living designer. They are encoded in the alien language etched into the marker's physical surface, transmitted continuously by the electromagnetic signal the artifact emits. Those instructions reach the dead cells before decay fully progresses, and they begin rebuilding. The connective tissue strengthens. The musculature reorganizes into configurations that serve a different function than the original human body required. Bones extend and harden beyond their original parameters. Limbs develop new articulation points, new capabilities that the human form never needed because the human form was designed for a different purpose. The purpose of a necromorph is specific and consistent across every variant. Acquire more corpses, spread the infection, increase the mass available for what comes next. Understanding the variety within the necromorph taxonomy reveals something important about the nature of the outbreak. The specific form a necromorph takes depends on the condition of the body it is built from. Adults who died from trauma to specific regions of the body produce different results than those who died from different causes. The most common form, the slasher, arises from a relatively intact adult body, the limbs having elongated and the arms developing blade-like bone protrusions that weaponize the skeleton itself against the living. The lurker type, which is smaller and capable of launching projectiles and accessing areas that bipedal forms cannot easily reach, is created from infants and small children. This detail exists in the game's canon with total matter-of-fact coldness, and it lands exactly as hard as it should. The infector is the form most responsible for the rapid spread of any outbreak. This creature moves through an area seeking intact corpses, bodies that have died recently and have not yet been converted, and introduces the infection directly. Its biological mechanisms adapted specifically for rapid transmission. An infector moving through a room full of dead crew members is not a threat to living individuals in the immediate violent way that a slasher is. Its threat is systemic. Every body it reaches will rise. Every corpse is raw material. The infector is, in effect, the recruitment mechanism of the outbreak, transforming the dead from neutral to actively hostile with terrifying efficiency. This is why the standard combat logic of conventional horror does not work against a necromorph infestation. In most combat scenarios, destroying an enemy removes the threat and leaves a neutral corpse. In Dead Space's framework, every corpse is a potential additional enemy, every fallen opponent a future infector target, every person you could not save a body that will eventually stand up and come for you. The game's famous tactical dismemberment system, the necessity of cutting off limbs rather than delivering killing blows to the torso, exists precisely because of this. Destroying the mobility of a necromorph prevents the infector from working with an intact body. You cannot stop what is coming. You can only manage the rate at which it arrives. There is something philosophically terrifying about this that Dead Space rarely makes explicit but always implies. In conventional warfare and survival scenarios, the dead are neutral. They are the proof that a threat has been eliminated. The presence of a corpse means the danger that corpse represented has passed. The Ishimura inverts this entirely. The dead are not proof that a threat has ended. The dead are the threat's primary recruitment pool. The more people die aboard the Ishimura, the worse the infestation becomes, and the infestation's purpose is to ensure that more people die. This is a closed loop, a self-reinforcing cycle. The only escape from it requires either leaving the environment entirely or eliminating the signal that maintains the infection. which requires finding and destroying the marker. Both of these options require Isaac to move deeper into the worst place he has ever been. Consider what that means as a psychological experience for the player and for Isaac as a character. There is a horror concept sometimes described as closing space, the experience of finding that every direction you might run leads towards something worse, that the environment is not just dangerous but actively collapsing the number of safe options available to you. The Ishimura is a masterwork of closing space. Going backward means retracing corridors that have had additional time to accumulate necromorphs. Going forward means entering sections where the outbreak is denser, where bodies are fresher, where the infector's work is more recent. Staying still is death. Waiting for rescue is death. Doing nothing is simply choosing which direction the end comes from. The brute presents something specific that the slasher and lurker do not. This is not a single person converted, it is multiple bodies merged. The marker's instruction set apparently capable of combining multiple corpses into a single larger organism when the conditions require it. The resulting creature has a bulk that cannot be dismembered through conventional means. That requires a different approach. That represents the marker's capacity for escalation. If the infection needs a more formidable threat to overcome a particular obstacle, like a living engineer who has learned to deal with standard necromorphs, the architecture of the outbreak can produce one. This is not something the game makes explicit in its lore dialogue, but the existence of the brute type implies it. The infection is responsive to resistance. Impurity, then, is not the only category Carroll's framework applies here. The other element is adaptability. Monsters that remain constant are eventually manageable. The necromorphs are not constant, they are iterative. The infection that produced a slasher from crew member A produces a lurker from the infant in the medical bay, and an infector from the body in the corridor, and a brute from the bodies piled in the engineering junction, because each form serves a specific operational function in the broader project of maximizing dead body acquisition. This is horror that thinks, or rather, and this distinction is important, it is horror that was designed by something that thought very carefully about how to build the optimal system for converting the living into raw material. That something is the marker. And the marker, unlike any monster Isaac might fight with a plasma cutter and enough ammunition, does not have a body. It cannot be dismembered. Its most powerful weapon was never a necromorph. Its most powerful weapon was always the signal it had been broadcasting since before anyone on the Ishimura knew what was happening. The signal that was already inside Isaac's head. We are roughly at the midpoint of the first arc of this story, and there is something that needs to be said here before we go further. Something that changes what you have understood so far about why Isaac was on that ship at all. The distress signal that brought the Kellyan and its crew to the Ishimura, the signal Chief Security Officer Alyssa Vincent sent as a desperate last resort to bring help to the dying ship, was placed by a woman who was in the grip of the marker's influence. She launched it because a hallucination appeared to her, a hallucination of someone she trusted, showing her that launching this signal was the right thing to do, guiding her hand as she completed the action she believed was her choice. The marker needed more people. It needed a specific kind of people. It needed someone with the marker's imprint already forming in their mind, someone psychologically prepared to be used as a vessel for the next stage of its plan. It broadcast a hallucination of a dead person to a dying woman, guided her into sending a message across the darkness of space, and waited for the kind of grief that would answer that call without examining why it felt so compelled to do so. That explains why the distress signal existed, but it does not explain why Isaac was the one chosen, why his mind specifically was what the marker needed. The answer to that is one of the most disturbing things in the entire Dead Space mythology, and it begins not with the events on the Ishimura, but with what happened to Isaac after the Ishimura, after he survived, after he thought the worst was over. The facility on Titan Station that held him for 2 years was not a hospital. Chapter 4. The Signal in the Skull. There is a medical concept called a parasitic relationship between a stimulus and a response. In ordinary sensory processing, the brain receives information from the environment, categorizes it, and generates an appropriate behavioral output. You see a fire, your brain categorizes it as dangerous, you move away from it. You hear a familiar voice, your brain categorizes it as known and safe, you move toward it. The relationship between the stimulus and the response is one of honest representation. The fire is actually there. The voice actually belongs to someone you know. The brain's job is to accurately translate external reality into internal guidance. The marker breaks this relationship at the deepest possible level. The electromagnetic signal the marker broadcasts does not only affect dead tissue, it begins its work on living minds long before any necromorph has appeared. The first symptom is insomnia. Not the mild insomnia of stress or anxiety, but a profound inability to achieve the deep restorative sleep that the brain requires to maintain normal function. Crew logs recovered from the Ishimura document this in the early stages of the outbreak, before most of the crew understood what was happening to them. People reporting that they could not sleep, that every time they closed their eyes the noise in their head became louder, that they could not distinguish between being awake and being in some intermediate state where they were technically at rest but receiving no benefit from it. Sleep deprivation does something very specific to the human brain's threat detection systems. The amygdala, the structure responsible for processing fear responses, becomes hyperactivated in sleep-deprived individuals. In one well-documented study, people who had been kept awake for extended periods showed heightened amygdala response to images that would not normally register as threatening at all. Neutral faces, mild irritants, background noise. The deprived brain, in its exhaustion, begins misclassifying safe things as dangerous because the calibration system that normally adjusts threat assessment has lost its proper tuning. Everything feels like a warning. Now add to that baseline the marker's specific next stage. The hallucinations begin with dead loved ones. This is not coincidence. This is not a random feature of how the marker signal interacts with human neurology. The marker produces hallucinations specifically structured around the individuals in the affected person's grief, the people they have lost, the relationships that remain unresolved, the emotional wounds that have never properly healed. For Isaac, the hallucination was Nicole. For other crew members on the Ishimura, it was whoever occupied that specific position in their psychology, the person they could not stop thinking about in the dark. The face that appeared behind closed eyes during the insomnia the marker was simultaneously producing. This specificity is the marker's most elegant and most disturbing feature. A random hallucination can be dismissed. The brain has robust mechanisms for categorizing anomalous perceptual experiences as internal rather than external. We call this reality testing, and most people can apply it even in states of significant stress. But a hallucination of someone you loved, someone whose face your brain has been rehearsing for years, someone whose voice is stored in your auditory memory with perfect fidelity, that hallucination passes every reality test your brain runs because it looks and sounds exactly like the thing it's pretending to be. The marker is not generating random noise. It is reading you, finding what you love, using that as the signal carrier. Consider what this means for Isaac in particular. He arrived on the Ishimura with his grief for Nicole already organized around an unresolved conversation, already primed to respond to any stimulus that suggested Nicole was reachable. Nicole was present. Nicole needed him. The marker did not need to construct a complicated deception. It needed only to put Nicole's face on something that was already there, and Isaac's own love would supply the rest of the belief. His need to find her, to reach her, to complete what had been torn open between them, that need was the operating system the marker ran its program on. Every time the hallucination of Nicole appeared and directed Isaac to do something, move in a specific direction, activate a specific system, complete a specific repair, it was operating through the most trustworthy source of guidance Isaac had ever known. Not an authority figure, not a government directive, not a religious instruction. The face of the person he loved, speaking in her voice, asking him for help. The help it was asking for was the furthering of the marker's agenda. The help it was asking for was, ultimately, the completion of what the marker needed. This is an important distinction from the conventional horror monster. The xenomorph and alien wants to survive and reproduce. The creatures in the thing want to consume and spread. These are drives that, while terrifying, are at least legible as biological imperatives. The marker is operating at a higher level of abstraction. It does not simply want to harm Isaac, it wants to use Isaac. The harm it does to him is the operating cost of using him, not the goal. The goal is the agenda that his specific mind, with its specific grief and its specific guilt and its specific psychological vulnerabilities, makes him uniquely suited to advance. This is where marker dementia becomes relevant as a concept. The condition Isaac was eventually diagnosed with, the specific form of cognitive deterioration produced by sustained marker exposure, is not simply a disease in the conventional sense. It is something closer to the marker writing its own operating instructions into a living brain. The signal that enters through sustained proximity does not only produce hallucinations, it imprints blueprints. The genetic and structural instructions for creating marker copies were transmitted into Isaac's mind during his time aboard the Ishimura, embedded in his neurology at a level below conscious access, stored in regions of his brain that he could not voluntarily examine or control. He left the Ishimura carrying the marker's reproductive code inside his head. He did not know this. Nobody told him. The people who discovered it, the EarthGov agents who recovered what was left of the Kellyan mission, who found Isaac among the debris, who brought him to Titan Station under the cover of medical treatment, chose not to share this information with him. Their reasons were institutional rather than compassionate. The knowledge had value. Isaac's contaminated mind had value. The dementia that made him a damaged, dependent patient made him a compliant subject, so he was sedated. Memory suppressants were administered, pharmaceutical compounds designed to prevent the marker-imprinted knowledge from surfacing into conscious experience, to keep it safely stored in neural structures that could be accessed by the right kind of external stimulation without Isaac's knowledge or consent. The Noontech diagnostic machine, which was used in sessions conducted while Isaac was under various forms of sedation, reached into those stored blueprints and extracted them through a probe inserted directly through the eye into the brain. Isaac Clarke spent 3 years being farmed for information he did not know he possessed, stored in a padded cell on Titan Station. His mind harvested repeatedly for marker construction data, kept functional enough to continue yielding knowledge through pharmaceutical management of the dementia symptoms that would have otherwise progressed to a point where the information became inaccessible. He believed, to whatever extent the memory suppressants allowed him to form coherent beliefs at all, that he was receiving treatment. What was being built from the blueprints extracted from his mind, the Site 12 marker, the largest red marker ever constructed by human hands, was already reaching completion in a government facility on the same station where he slept in his medicated haze. The marker he had fought to destroy on Aegis 7 had left its architectural plans in his neurons, and those plans were being assembled into something exponentially larger right next door to where he was stored. And then the new marker's signal began to bleed through the containment measures, and the sedation protocols stopped working completely. And Isaac Clarke woke up in a padded cell covered in marker symbols he had drawn in his sleep, wearing a straitjacket, with no memory of the past 3 years. He was freed by a man named Franco, who was transformed into a necromorph immediately afterward. Dead Space 2 begins exactly where Dead Space 1 left off, with a broken man in an impossible situation, with no resources and no allies, running from something that wants to use him for purposes he does not yet understand. The specific horror of the second game is that it makes Isaac's victimhood explicit in a way the first game left implicit. He was not just a survivor. He was a resource, a piece of living infrastructure that EarthGov needed functioning just well enough to yield what was in his head. The hallucination of Nicole had new functions in the second game. The marker-imprinted version of her that lived in Isaac's dementia was not simply trying to guide him anymore. It was trying to kill him. More precisely, it was trying to get him to kill himself. The marker needed a specific death at a specific location to complete the convergence process it was working toward, and that death, according to the marker's architecture, needed to be Isaac's. The thing wearing Nicole's face spent the second game moving between guidance and threat, between manipulation and direct attack, using Isaac's unresolved love for her as the delivery mechanism for its instructions. The specific psychological brutality of this deserves a moment of acknowledgement. The most painful loss of Isaac's life had been converted into a weapon aimed at him. the grief he had never been able to process, the guilt he had never been able to discharge, the apology he had never been able to deliver. All of it had been captured by the marker signal and refashioned into something that wore the face of the person he would have done anything to reach, not because the marker understood love, because it understood that love is the most reliable vector for compliance. This is the mechanism the horror is really built on. Fear of monsters is visceral and immediate, but it is also navigable. Monsters can be shot and dismembered and sometimes outrun. What cannot be outrun is the voice of someone you love, telling you that everything is all right, that you just need to do this one more thing, that she will be there at the end of it. The thing that saved Isaac in the end was not strength or firepower or the ability to survive things that should have killed him. It was the moment he stopped believing the hallucination, the moment he stood inside the marker's constructed reality, inside what amounted to the architecture of his own grief, shaped and furnished and occupied by the thing that had been using Nicole's image as a tool, and said out loud that it was not her, that what he had been chasing across 2 games and countless dead corridors was not the person he had lost, and that the apology he owed her was not something this construct could receive on her behalf. He destroyed the Site 12 marker by refusing to complete what it needed from him. The grief that had been weaponized against him became, in that final confrontation, the source of the only immunity he had ever possessed. He knew what the real Nicole felt like. He knew what she sounded like when she wasn't trying to kill him, and the marker's recreation, for all its precision, could not fully replicate the specific texture of a real relationship. The kindness she had for him in her sane moments, the actual warmth that existed between them before everything fractured, that imperfection was the crack the marker could not fill. He survived. The sprawl was largely destroyed in the outbreak. The Site 12 marker was gone. EarthGov's investment in the Project Telomere program, and everything it had built using the blueprints from Isaac's violated mind, collapsed in the fire. But Isaac's mind still carried the marker's imprint. Years later, hidden in an apartment on a lunar colony, he was still writing marker symbols in his sleep, still showing the signs of a contamination that had no complete cure because the information encoded in his neurons was not a virus that could be purged, but a set of instructions woven into the basic architecture of how his brain processed certain kinds of knowledge. He was permanently marked, in every sense of that word. This is the point at which a specific question becomes relevant that most discussions of Dead Space never directly address. If the marker's signal is this specifically targeted, this precisely calibrated to individual psychological vulnerabilities, this architecturally sophisticated in its ability to identify and exploit specific forms of human damage, then what is it? Where does that sophistication come from? What kind of thing constructs a tool this carefully? The answer is not on the Ishimura. The answer is not even in the Church of Unitology, though the church is where most people first encounter the framework that names what the markers actually are. The answer requires going back almost 200 years before Isaac Clarke was born, to a crater in the earth that had been there for 65 million years, and a man who found something buried at the bottom of it that he spent the rest of his short life wishing he had never touched. Keep this in your mind as we go into the next section. The Church of Unitology has billions of members by the time of Dead Space. Billions of people who have built their entire spiritual framework around the marker, who have organized the meaning of their lives around the promise the marker represents, and the man those billions of people worship as a prophet and a martyr, the man whose name is the first word of their daily prayer, never believed a single thing the church teaches. He tried to destroy the marker, and the people who built the church killed him to use his face. Chapter 5: The Prophet Who Never Believed. To understand Unitology, you need to understand something about how institutional power works when it is divorced from the thing it claims to represent. There is a pattern that appears throughout the history of ideological movements, religious and political both, where the founding figures of a movement have a complex and often adversarial relationship with the ideas later attributed to them. The movement develops not from the founder's genuine beliefs, but from how other people interpreted, edited, and ultimately mythologized those beliefs after the founder could no longer object. The founder becomes a symbol, their actual views no longer relevant or even retrievable, and the symbol is used to authorize things the original person would have found repugnant. Michael Altman was a geophysicist. He was part of a research team that discovered the black marker buried in an ancient impact crater on Earth, a crater that had been forming geological strata for tens of millions of years. The marker had arrived with the asteroid that created that crater, the same impact that produced the mass extinction event responsible for the end of the dinosaurs, had also deposited, in the sediment of that ecological catastrophe, an alien artifact that had been waiting there ever since. Waiting, in the specific sense of something designed to be found, patient in the way that only something operating on geological timescales can afford to be. The government of Earth at the time, the Sovereign Colonies Administration, chose to suppress the discovery. The existence of an alien artifact was information that carried implications that no government wanted to manage. The implications for religion, for politics, for the fundamental human understanding of humanity's uniqueness and place in the cosmos. The standard institutional response to profoundly destabilizing information is concealment, and the sovereign colonies applied that response with considerable competence. The research facility was classified, the team was isolated. The study of the marker continued in conditions of complete secrecy. Altman was the member of the team who chose not to stay silent. His decision to go public with the marker's existence has been interpreted as an act of faith by the hundreds of millions of unitologists who regard him as a martyr and prophet. It was not an act of faith, it was an act of conscience rooted in what Altman had witnessed the marker doing to the people around him. The hallucinations, the violent episodes, the psychological deterioration that mirrored exactly what would happen decades later aboard the Ishimura. He did not leak this information because the marker had shown him divine truth. He leaked it because he had watched colleagues lose their minds and wanted the broader world to understand what was buried in that crater. He survived a necromorph outbreak at the facility. He watched the institution that had been studying the marker fail catastrophically. Its staff transformed into or destroyed by the same process that would consume the Ishimura crew centuries later. He survived because of his own particular combination of resourcefulness and what might be called a non-receptive psychology, a mind that, for reasons that remain unclear in the documented history, was not as fully captured by the marker's signal as those around him. He wanted to destroy the artifact. He attempted to do so, and the attempt failed. He was captured by two men, Markov and Stevens. Stevens, notably, was a psychologist who had been working alongside Altman at the research facility. These two men had reached their own conclusions about the marker through their exposure to it. Where Altman saw danger and a threat to human life, Stevens and Markov saw the beginning of something they chose to interpret as transcendence. The marker's signal had offered them the same promise it offers everyone it touches, structured in the specific language of their own psychological needs. The promise of unity, of transformation, of a resolution to the fundamental human experience of separation and mortality. They believed it, or they chose to believe it. The psychological distinction between genuine belief and the decision to commit to a belief because the alternative is less bearable is not always cleanly available from the outside. These two men recognized that Altman's act of going public had already made him a figure of significant cultural resonance. People who had learned of the marker's existence through his disclosure were already organizing around him, attributing to him a significance and a wisdom that his own stated positions did not support. He had become, against his will and without his participation, the nucleus of a growing movement that was desperate for a prophet. Stevens and Markov murdered Michael Altman. They then presented themselves as his disciples, his acolytes, the people who had known him and could interpret his teachings. They built the Church of Unitology around the carefully edited version of Altman that served their purposes, a visionary who had understood the marker's true nature and given his life to share that knowledge with humanity. In their telling, Altman was assassinated by the government to suppress the transformative truth he carried. and the truth he had actually carried was far less certain than that. He had told the world the marker existed, admitted on record that he did not know what it was for, and refused to let it stay buried. That was all. This foundation of deliberate murder and deliberate deception is not just a historical detail. It is the structural blueprint of everything unitology becomes, a religion built on the corpse of someone who disagreed with it, using his face to sell a message he would have rejected, growing for 2 centuries on the spiritual needs of billions of people who had no access to the actual history of their own faith. The church's hierarchy understood the truth. The true history of Altman was not entirely lost, and the upper echelons of unitology possessed documentation of what had actually happened. They chose to maintain the lie because the lie served the mission. This is where unitology's specific horror diverges from the garden-variety institutional hypocrisy of any religion that has drifted from its origins. The mission is not wealth accumulation or social control or the kind of ordinary institutional self-preservation that drives most organized fraud. The mission is convergence. Unitologists believe, with the sincere fervor of people whose spiritual lives are organized entirely around this belief, that the marker represents the path to a higher form of existence. The religion's central doctrines teach that human beings are incomplete, that the sense of separation and isolation fundamental to individual consciousness is not a permanent condition but a temporary state that the marker's promise can resolve. The phrase, "make us whole," resonates through unitology's liturgy not as a metaphor, but as a literal description of what the faithful anticipate, a transformation that dissolves individual boundaries and merges human consciousness into something collective and complete. This is a genuinely sophisticated theological framework, and it is worth sitting with that fact for a moment rather than dismissing it. The promise unitology makes is not absurd on its face. The experience of profound isolation, of being trapped inside a single perspective, unable to fully bridge the gap between your internal experience and another person's, is genuinely one of the most painful aspects of human consciousness. Philosophers have been writing about this problem for as long as humans have had philosophy. The yearning to be truly, completely known, to have the boundaries between self and other dissolve in genuine understanding. That yearning is not pathological. It is one of the most deeply human things there is. What unitology has done with extraordinary precision is to take that genuine spiritual longing and attach it to the mechanism that is designed to feed the brethren moons. The theological doctrine of convergence exactly describes the literal process of a convergence event, a gathering of transformed bodies, a merging of individual forms into a collective, the dissolution of separateness into unity. The experience unitologists anticipate with hope and faith is the experience of having their biomass incorporated into a necromorph moon. The prayer they offer to the marker is a prayer directed through the marker to the Brethren Moon network that uses the marker as its broadcasting antenna. Every unitologist who prays, who tithes, who recruits another believer, who places a marker in a position of cultural prominence, is serving an agenda that has been operating since before the first human beings walked the earth. This is not something the average unitologist knows. The rank-and-file membership is not told what convergence actually means in physical terms. They are given the spiritual version of the doctrine, the elevated language of transformation and ascension, and allowed to fill in the specifics with whatever interpretation their personal spirituality supports. The hierarchy knows more. The innermost circles know everything and have chosen, with full information, to serve the process that will end human civilization. There is a real-world parallel worth drawing here. The history of cult psychology documents repeatedly that the most effective recruitment mechanisms for genuinely harmful ideological movements are not the extreme positions that make the movement's true nature obvious. They are the early stages, the entry-level doctrines that reflect something genuinely resonant in human experience, community, purpose, transcendence, the resolution of loneliness. People are not recruited by the harmful endpoint. They are recruited by the legitimate need the organization initially presents itself as addressing, and then move through stages of commitment until they are psychologically invested enough to accept escalating revelations that they would have rejected had they been presented them at the beginning. Unitology demonstrates this structure with remarkable clarity. New members are offered community, comfort, and a framework for understanding their place in the cosmos. The financial contributions required are presented as expressions of commitment rather than as mechanisms of control. The hierarchy is revealed gradually, with access to deeper knowledge gated behind demonstrated loyalty and escalating investment. By the time a member has access to the level of doctrine that approaches the true nature of the marker and the real meaning of convergence, they have been in the organization long enough, given enough, and surrounded themselves with enough fellow unitologists that leaving would require dismantling their entire social and spiritual infrastructure. The church is specifically designed to make this cost prohibitive. Octavia Clarke was not a fool. She was not uniquely vulnerable or uniquely damaged. She was a woman who had experienced the specific kind of loneliness that Unitology's early doctrine is designed to address, and she had been recruited skillfully and moved through the commitment escalation process by people who were very good at what they did. By the time the tithing demands had stripped the Clarke family estate and her psychology had reorganized entirely around the church's framework, the recruitment had already succeeded at every stage where it could have been interrupted. Isaac's hatred of Unitology is therefore not simple. It contains the grief of losing his mother twice, once to the church's influence, once to the psychosis that ended both her life and his father's. It contains the rage of watching an institution he could not fight from outside take everything his family had and leave him with a debt of unprocessed grief that shaped everything that came after. And it contains something else that Dead Space occasionally makes visible, a recognition that his mother's loneliness, the loneliness Unitology had exploited, was real, that the need the church had targeted was not fabricated or irrational, that she had been looking for something genuine and had been handed something that looked exactly like it. The Church of Unitology, by the time of Dead Space's events, is not a fringe movement. It is a civilization-spanning institution with billions of adherents, massive financial resources, deep infiltration into governmental and corporate structures, and, crucially, access to markers. The Church's relationship with the markers is not purely theological, it is operational. Members in positions of authority actively work to acquire markers, to move them, to place them in environments where their signal can begin the process of influence, to position the church to be present at any convergence event that results. This is where EarthGov's institutional involvement becomes relevant, because EarthGov and Unitology, despite their surface-level antagonism, were both doing versions of the same thing. Both were treating the marker as a resource to be controlled rather than a threat to be eliminated. Both had suppressed information about the true nature of the artifact that would have allowed humanity to make an informed collective decision about what to do with it. Both had organized their institutional power around the possession of something that was using them. EarthGov wanted the marker's energy potential and its technological implications. Unitology wanted the spiritual legitimacy of controlling the path to convergence. The marker wanted both of them to keep studying it, keep replicating it, keep spreading it, keep arguing about it, because all of that activity served the same end. The ship logs from the Ishimura tell a story that sounds on its surface like a corporate failure story, a classified operation to retrieve the red marker from Aegis 7, senior officers aware of the true purpose of the mission, protocols designed to maintain operational secrecy, the first signs of the marker's influence dismissed by authority figures who had institutional reasons to continue the mission regardless of what the crew was experiencing. A captain losing his grip on reality in ways that were reported to higher authorities and addressed through measures focused on maintaining secrecy rather than addressing the root cause. But underneath that corporate failure narrative is something older and more deliberate. The reason the mission happened at all, the reason the Ishimura was sent to retrieve a marker that most of its crew did not know was on the planet, the reason the classified operation existed in the first place, all of that traces back to institutional decisions made by people who understood, to varying degrees, what the marker was. People who chose to continue exposure and study and replication because the potential gains, energy, technology, spiritual monopoly, outweighed, in their accounting, the risks to the people who would be placed in proximity to the thing. The crew of the Ishimura did not die in an accident. They died in a calculated bet made by institutions that had decided their lives were an acceptable operating cost. This is the systemic horror that runs beneath Dead Space's monster horror. And it is one that, as we examine the full architecture of the marker's purpose and what the Brethren Moon Network actually represents, becomes considerably darker. Because if you follow the logic of the marker's design far enough, if you trace the thread from the specific calibration of its psychological effects, to the specific theology that developed around it, to the specific institutional decisions that kept spreading it, you arrive at a conclusion that a scientist named Kinner Phelps, working in EarthGov's Project Telomere program on Titan Station, documented in a series of logs before his growing obsession with the marker's signal consumed what remained of his critical faculties. He wrote this, that human beings are not independent agents who encountered the markers by chance, that the marker's signal is not a side effect of proximity to a powerful artifact, that the rationalizations people develop for studying, replicating, and distributing the markers are not original thoughts formed by independent minds, that the brilliant engineers and scientists and theologians and politicians who have spent centuries working toward the conditions the markers require have been, in the most fundamental sense, operating on instructions they believed were their own, that everything humanity has built, the drive to explore, the impulse to discover, the institutions that organize those drives into coordinated planetary action, may have been shaped from the very beginning by a signal buried in a crater on Earth 65 million years ago. The marker did not arrive when humanity found it. It arrived when the dinosaurs died. And in the 65 million years between those two events, the signal did not sit silent. It did its other job, the slower one, the one that required geological patience and a species with enough cognitive complexity to receive more subtle instructions. This is the layer of dead space that does not announce itself loudly. It sits under everything else, visible only when you have assembled all the other pieces and stepped back far enough to see the shape they make together. And if that is true, if the civilization that built the telescopes that found the other markers, and the ships that carried researchers to study them, and the corporations that extracted them, and the religions that organized around them, and the governments that weaponized them, if all of that was not independent human development, but the intended outcome of a signal planted here before humans existed at all, then the horror stops being about a broken ship in space. It becomes about everything. Chapter 6. The Government That Needed You Broken. There is a framework in organizational psychology called the normalization of deviance. The concept was developed by sociologist Diane Vaughan in the aftermath of the Challenger space shuttle disaster, when her research into how the disaster happened led her to a disturbing conclusion. The engineers and administrators who made decisions that led to the destruction of the Challenger and the deaths of its crew were not negligent in the way the word normally implies. They were not incompetent. They were not indifferent to human life in any straightforward sense. What they were was institutionally conditioned to accept, over time and through small incremental steps, risk levels that should have remained unacceptable each time a component performed adequately, despite showing warning signs. That adequacy was noted and incorporated into the institutional baseline of what was considered normal risk. Each time the margin between acceptable and catastrophic was crossed without catastrophe resulting, the crossing itself was absorbed into the definition of safe operation. The institutional memory of each near miss was structured not as a warning about what could happen, but as evidence that what had happened was survivable. The deviance became normal. The warning signs became routine data points, and the disaster, when it finally arrived, was not a sudden failure. It was the logical terminus of a process that had been building quietly for years, visible to anyone who looked at the full pattern of the data, but invisible to the institutional processes that had been designed to manage individual incidents in isolation, rather than recognize systemic trajectories. EarthGov's relationship with the markers is the normalization of deviance at civilizational scale. By the time of Dead Space's events, EarthGov, the administrative body governing Earth and its colonies, has known about the markers for approximately 3 centuries. The black marker was discovered in the 21st century, studied covertly, leaked to the public by Michael Altman, and then partially reclaimed by governmental authority when unitology's rise made complete suppression impossible. The records of what the sovereign colonies learned from their initial study of the black marker were not destroyed. They were classified, transferred through successive governmental lineages with each change of administration, filed in archives that required specific clearances to access. Those archives documented, with considerable clinical precision, what happens to human beings in proximity to markers: the insomnia, the hallucinations, the violence, the conversion of the dead, the catastrophic potential of a convergence event. These were not unknown quantities when EarthGov began its own red marker research programs centuries later. The institutional knowledge existed. It was simply distributed across classification levels, designed to prevent the full picture from being assembled by anyone without authorization to see all of it simultaneously. This structure, information that is technically available within an institution but practically inaccessible because of how it has been organized, is one of the most effective mechanisms of bureaucratic plausible deniability ever developed. If a catastrophe occurs, no individual decision-maker can be blamed for failing to account for the risks, because no individual decision-maker had access to the complete picture of what those risks were. The person who authorized the mining operation on Aegis 7 had access to files describing the marker's effects on crew cognition, but not to the files describing a convergence event. The person with access to the convergence event files had authority over theological policy, but not over mining operations. The person with both sets of clearances was a committee of senior administrators who met quarterly and whose minutes were classified separately from the underlying data they were drawing on. Nobody made a decision to let the Ishimura crew die. Hundreds of people made small decisions within their specific information environments that collectively produced that outcome. This is not an accident of bureaucratic inefficiency. This is design. This is what institutions look like when the people at the top understand the full nature of what they are doing and have constructed the organizational architecture to ensure accountability cannot land anywhere specific. The research program that operated on Titan Station, the program that held Isaac Clarke for 3 years in a facility he was told was a hospital, was designated Project Telomere. The name is significant in a way that is probably not coincidental. Telomeres are the protective caps on the ends of chromosomes, structures that preserve genetic integrity during cell division, that gradually shorten with each replication cycle, that ultimately determine a cell's lifespan by establishing how many times it can successfully reproduce before the genetic information it carries begins to degrade. The program named itself after a biological mechanism for measuring how many times something can be used before it falls apart. Isaac was patient 4. Nolan Strauss was patient 5. There were others, unnamed in the records Isaac was eventually able to access, who had survived exposure to markers and been collected by EarthGov's retrieval teams and brought to Titan Station for the same process Isaac endured. Each of them carried marker-imprinted knowledge in their neurological architecture. Each of them was a resource to be extracted. The Noontech diagnostic machine sessions were not therapeutic procedures disguised as exploitation. They were extraction procedures conducted on living human beings, reaching through a needle inserted into the brain to harvest information those human beings had no ability to consent to sharing because they did not know they possessed it. The memory suppressants served 2 functions. The first was the one officially documented in the medical records EarthGov maintained, managing the dementia symptoms to keep the patients functional enough for continued sessions. The second function was never documented because documenting it would have required acknowledging it. The suppressants prevented the patients from accumulating conscious knowledge of what was being done to them. They prevented Isaac from forming the kind of persistent memory of his situation that would have allowed him to understand, even approximately, what the past 3 years of his life had consisted of. He woke up without 3 years of his life. He woke up having been used in ways that would have required his active consent if EarthGov had been operating as anything other than an institution that had normalized the treatment of marker-touched individuals. as instrumentally valuable rather than as people. The Site 12 marker's construction was the project's primary deliverable. Every session with Isaac and the other patients was working toward the completion of this structure, described in the internal documentation as a fully expressed physical representation of the algorithms embedded in Isaac Clarke's mind by Marker 3A, the largest man-made marker ever constructed, built on Titan Station in the government sector, shielded from the civilian population of the sprawl by layers of security clearance and physical isolation. Director Hans Tiedemann understood what he was building. The logs Isaac encountered during his journey through the sprawl make clear that Tiedemann was not a true believer in the marker's divine purpose. He was a technocrat who had assessed the marker as a power source and a technological asset that EarthGov needed to control before Unitology did. His framework for the Site 12 project was strategic, not theological. He wanted to harness what the marker represented without submitting to what Unitology claimed it required. This rationalization is genuinely sophisticated, and it is worth pausing on because it represents a failure mode that recurs through the history of humanity's relationship with technologies whose full implications were not understood. The person who says, "We will use this, but we will use it carefully, under controlled conditions, with proper safeguards, without giving ourselves over to irrational belief about what it represents." The person who is certain that the difference between safe use and catastrophic use is a matter of sufficient institutional control and professional competence. Tiedemann was wrong in the specific way that this kind of rationalization is always wrong in Dead Space's universe. The marker does not distinguish between people who believe in it theologically and people who are trying to study it dispassionately. Its signal operates regardless of the philosophical framework of the minds receiving it. The scientists working on Project Telomere were not protected from the marker's influence by their professional skepticism. The containment measures designed by very capable engineers could not fully insulate a sprawl-sized population from an artifact of the marker's power. The bleed-through that triggered the necromorph outbreak was not a failure of technical competence. It was the marker operating within its designed parameters. The Site 12 marker was complete enough. It had been fed enough necromorph biomass through the contamination of Project Telomere's research environment, and it began broadcasting. What happened to the Sprawl's population in the events of Dead Space 2 is the same thing that happened to the Ishimura's crew, scaled upward by orders of magnitude. The Sprawl was not a ship, it was a city built across the remnants of Saturn's moon Titan, housing a civilian population in the hundreds of thousands, with schools and shopping districts and residential blocks and all the infrastructure of human settlement adapted to the conditions of space, and the marker's signal moved through all of it, through the ventilation systems, through the water supply's atmospheric processing, through every medium that connected one space of human habitation to another. The pack, which appeared for the first time in the Sprawl outbreak, represents something specific about what the marker does when it has access to a full civilian population, rather than just an industrial ship crew. These were children, smaller forms, faster in certain ways, capable of overwhelming through numbers what they could not achieve individually. The existence of the pack in the outbreak's necromorph taxonomy means that the children who lived in the Sprawl's residential sections were present in the early stages of the infestation. They died there, or were killed by those already transformed, and the marker's signal found them. There is a form of moral horror that goes beyond the visceral reaction to individual violence, something that emerges when you understand the full scope of what an institution's choices have produced. The children of the Sprawl did not need to die. They were not collateral damage in a conflict that could not have been avoided. They were the predictable consequence of a decision made by Director Tiedemann and the institutional hierarchy above him to build a marker on a station with a civilian population, because the energy potential and the technological intelligence being gathered was valuable enough to justify the operational security risks. Tiedemann knew what a marker could do when its containment failed. The classified archives that informed his project's design contained that information. He built it anyway, on a station full of families, because the institutional calculus decided that the risk was manageable. and the intelligence was too valuable to relocate to a less populated environment. This is the specific form of institutional evil that Dead Space constructs. It is not the evil of people who wanted to hurt others. It is the evil of people who decided that others' lives were an acceptable variable in an equation they had the authority to define. EarthGov did not want to kill the residents of the Sprawl. It wanted the marker's energy potential and the marker's technological secrets. And the residents of the Sprawl were simply present in the same location where the risk of pursuing those things expressed itself. The normalization of deviance reaches its terminal point. Isaac survived the Sprawl, destroying the Site-12 marker through a confrontation that cost him more than physical injury. Ellie Langford, the CEC pilot who helped him through the disaster, survived and escaped. The Sprawl itself did not, by any reasonable measure, survive in the sense of remaining a viable human habitat. The institutions that had built it and the project that had compromised it were gone. The physical structure remained, contaminated and largely depopulated. Isaac remained as well, carrying the permanent weight of a mind that had been written on by something he could not erase. He went to the New Horizons lunar colony and tried to live quietly. He wrote marker symbols in his sleep on the walls of his apartment. He documented his own deterioration in personal logs that described a man who understood what was happening to him and could not prevent it. He was, in his own assessment, permanently broken. But the story was not finished with Isaac Clarke, because what the Site-12 marker had done in its brief completion before Isaac destroyed it was broadcast, and what it had broadcast had reached, across the enormous distances of interstellar space, something that had been waiting in the dark for a very long time, something frozen, something incomplete, something that had been sending the signal that all the markers carried, make us whole, for longer than the human species had existed, something that, when it received a strong enough reply, began to wake up. This is where everything you have understood so far changes, because we have been telling a story about human failure, institutional failure, individual failure, the failure of grief and trust and rational self-preservation. And those human failures are real and terrible and worth examining in their own right. But the human failures are not the source of the horror. They are the mechanism the source of the horror has been using. Somewhere in the deep cold, around Tau Volantis, the Brethren Moons were opening their eyes, and they were hungry, and they knew exactly where to find what they needed. Chapter 7, Make Us Whole. There is a phrase in Lovecraftian horror that describes a specific category of cosmic dread. The phrase is the indifference of the universe. The idea is that the source of cosmic horror is not malevolence. Malevolence at least implies that you matter to the thing that wants to harm you, that you have been specifically selected as an enemy, that your destruction serves some agenda in which you are a recognized participant. Lovecraftian horror removes that comfort entirely. The universe is not your enemy. The universe does not know you exist, and the forces that will eventually consume you are consuming you for reasons that have nothing to do with anything about you specifically. You are caught in something vast, and your experience of it as horror is entirely irrelevant to its operation. Dead Space, through the first two games, looks like Lovecraftian horror from the outside, but operates on a different principle. The marker does know you exist. It has found your specific psychological wound and used it with precision. Isaac Clarke matters to the marker in a very specific and instrumentally defined way. He has been selected, used, kept alive, and guided because he is useful. The horror of the first two games is the horror of being instrumentalized, of discovering that the thing you thought was guiding you through catastrophe was the catastrophe's architect, using your competence and your grief as levers to move you where it needed you. Dead Space 3 introduces the layer that makes this worse, because the marker is not the top of the hierarchy. The Brethren Moons are what the marker serves. To understand what this means, start with Tau Volantis, a planet frozen now in the deep reaches of space beyond normal human travel range in the 26th century, covered in ice, containing beneath that ice the ruins of a civilization that existed long before humanity's recorded history, an alien species that found a black marker, studied it, created copies of it, watched the outbreak begin, and responded. Their response is the most significant act of intelligent life documented in the Dead Space universe. They built a machine, a structure of sufficient scale and power to change the climate of an entire planet, to freeze its surface, to halt the process of convergence mid-formation and lock the developing moon in an incomplete state. The moon had already begun to form. The necromorph biomass had already been pulled into orbit, had already begun assembling into the structure of what would become a brethren moon, but the machine stopped it before it could complete. Think about what that required. An alien civilization in the middle of an extinction-level necromorph outbreak, its population being converted, its surface being consumed, with the convergence already in progress, somehow organized and executed an engineering project of planetary scope. They were dying. Most of them were probably already dead or converted. Whatever survived was functioning under conditions of absolute catastrophe. And in those conditions, some of them managed to build and activate a machine that froze their planet and stopped what was happening. They did not survive the doing of it. The civilization of Tau Volantis is gone, its only remnants archaeological traces beneath the ice. But the machine ran. It kept running for thousands of years in the absence of any operator, maintaining the planetary freeze, keeping the incomplete moon locked in orbit, prevented from finishing what the marker's agenda had set in motion. The moon, in this frozen and incomplete state, continued broadcasting. The signal that all markers carry was still being transmitted from the incomplete moon's core, reaching across the light years to the other markers seeded throughout the galaxy. But there was something additional in the signal, a desperation layered beneath the standard instruction set. The frozen moon needed the machine to be turned off. It needed someone to come to Tau Volantis, find the machine, and disable it. So its signal carried not only the standard call, "Make us whole," but also specific information that would guide a sufficiently developed intelligence toward the machine's location. That information was encoded in a way that would only be accessible to a species that had already been significantly developed by marker influence. The Tau Volantis data required scientific infrastructure that could travel to the planet, survive its conditions, and operate the machinery involved. The black marker had done its work on Earth over millions of years, developing humanity from whatever pre-civilizational state it encountered into a species with precisely the technological capacity required to find Tau Volantis and interact with the machine. Isaac Clarke and John Carver reached Tau Volantis. A unitologist leader named Jacob Danick reached it as well, and with sincere theological conviction, believing he was facilitating the ascension of humanity, he deactivated the machine the alien civilization had died to build and activate. The moon began waking, rising, completing. What an incomplete brethren moon looks like, close enough to observe, a structure the scale of a small planetoid. Its surface, a mass of necromorph biomass, organized into geological scale formations. Biology and geology merged so thoroughly that the distinction between living tissue and rock becomes meaningful. The interior contains chambers that function as something analogous to organs in a living body, spaces where consciousness of a kind resides, where the marker signal originates, where the collected biomass of countless dead civilizations has been organized over geological time into something that thinks and wants and broadcasts. What it wants is very simple: more. More biomass, more completed convergence events, more planets consumed, more civilizations incorporated, more raw material to feed the moon's continued growth and the continued growth of its network. The brethren moons are not a species in any biological sense. They are the accumulated product of a reproductive cycle that uses intelligent civilizations as raw material, the way that parasitic organisms use hosts, not as enemies to be defeated, but as resources to be consumed. This is the Lovecraftian horror that Dead Space 3 finally delivers, not the indifference of the universe. Something worse, the universe's attentiveness. The brethren moons are paying very close attention. They have been paying attention for millions of years. The black markers scattered throughout the galaxy are their sensory and reproductive organs, broadcasting the signal that simultaneously guides the development of civilizations and prepares those civilizations for consumption. Every species that has ever found a black marker, that has ever been influenced by the signal to develop the technology needed to reach the next stage, that has ever looked up at the sky and felt the pull toward exploration and discovery, has been responding to the marker's call. The drive that makes intelligent life reach for the stars may itself be the marker's program executing. Isaac and Carver managed to destroy the machine before the moon completed its formation. The resulting explosion destroyed it. In the immediate aftermath of that destruction, the signal that the moon had been broadcasting to the other markers in human-colonized space ceased. Without the signal, active necromorphs should have collapsed. The infection should have become inert. The moon had been awake long enough. Its last act, in the moments before the machine ended it, was to broadcast its location and status to the rest of the Brethren Moon network. The other moons, distributed across interstellar space, received that transmission. The signal that reached Isaac and Carver as they returned to what they believed was the safety of Earth was not from the dead moon on Tau Volantis. It was from the network itself. We are all awake now, awake and hungry. Take us home, Isaac. Make us whole. The last image of Dead Space 3's main story is Earth, with Brethren moons approaching it. The civilization that humanity had spent thousands of years building, the civilization that had produced the Concordance Extraction Corporation, and EarthGov, and the Church of Unitology, and the Planet Cracker ships, and the Deep Space colonies, had been, from its earliest origins, a project managed by something that intended to consume it. The markers that had shaped human development toward this endpoint were complete. The species was ready. The harvest was beginning. The horror of this revelation is not primarily emotional. It does not produce grief or rage in the way that personal losses do. What it produces, in the people who follow the logic far enough to reach this conclusion, is something closer to vertigo. The sensation of scale shifting abruptly, of a reference frame that had seemed stable suddenly relocating itself to a position from which everything looks different. Think about the experience of looking at what you believed was a random pattern and suddenly seeing the image hidden inside it. Once you see the image, the randomness disappears. The pattern was always there. Your previous perception of randomness was simply your failure to see it yet. Now it is impossible to unsee. Dead Space does this to human civilization. Every institution that seemed corrupt or failed or tragic, EarthGov's exploitation of Isaac, Unitology's weaponization of human spiritual longing, the Ishimura's mission, the planet crackers stripping worlds for resources, the colonial expansion into deep space, all of it, once you have the complete picture, resolves from random human failure into the intended outcome of a process that has been running for 65 million years. The randomness was always the image. The institutions were always part of the pattern. This is the cosmic horror that Dead Space earns. Not monsters, not government conspiracies, not even the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people across 3 games. The horror is the understanding that those deaths were never accidents, that the institutions that enabled those deaths were never simply flawed, that humanity's trajectory, from the crater in the Yucatan to the frozen surface of Tau Volantis, was a path laid out by something patient enough to wait for the right moment and the right people to walk it. There is a concept in trauma therapy sometimes called the moment of full understanding. It is not a pleasant moment, despite what its name suggests. Full understanding is the experience of assembling, for the first time, the complete picture of what was done to you, not in fragments as you encountered each piece, but as a whole pattern with its full implications visible. People who have this experience describe it as both clarifying and devastating. The clarity comes from no longer needing to hold the fragments in suspension, no longer needing to explain away the inconsistencies between what you were told and what you experienced. The devastation comes from the same source. Once you see the whole picture, the comfort of partial ignorance is gone permanently. Isaac Clarke, by the end of Dead Space 3, has the full picture. He understands as completely as any human being ever has what the markers are and what they were always building toward. He has this understanding in a mind that the markers imprinted with their own reproductive code that was used by a government he thought existed to protect him, that the hallucination of the woman he loved tried repeatedly to guide toward completing the process he spent 3 games resisting, He has survived everything. The Ishimura, Titan Station, Tau Volantis, the Brethren Moons are at Earth, and there is something in that specific ending that is worth examining not as a horror trope, but as a statement about the psychological experience of certain kinds of survival. Isaac has done everything right. He has made every sacrifice, survived every system that tried to use or destroy him, dismantled every marker placed in his path. He has refused to complete what the markers Nicole wanted him to complete. He has carried the weight of a permanently broken mind through every version of hell the series threw at him. And the reward for all of that is arriving home to find that home is already gone. There is a clinical term for the specific grief of a person who fought to survive a catastrophe while others did not, who returns to find that what they were fighting to get back to has been destroyed in their absence. The survivor who was not present for the final destruction, who carried the memory of what they were protecting as motivation through every terrible thing they endured, who reaches the destination of that endurance and finds it ash. Dead Space does not explain what happens next. The franchise's story is incomplete, unresolved in ways that are probably permanent, given the commercial history of the series. Isaac Clarke's final status in the narrative, whether he survived what the Brethren Moons were doing to Earth, whether there was any version of the future available to him, whether the Tau Volantis Moon's destruction actually had the systemic effect it should have had on the rest of the marker network, remains unresolved. That incompleteness is, perhaps unintentionally, the most accurate final statement the series could have made about what it is exploring. Trauma and the institutional forces that create it do not resolve cleanly. The person who survives abuse, exploitation, loss, and the full understanding of the systems that produce those experiences does not exit the other side into a tidy narrative conclusion. They carry forward into an uncertain future with a mind that has been permanently marked by everything it processed, looking for something livable in the aftermath of complete understanding. Isaac's apartment on the New Horizons lunar colony, with its walls covered in marker symbols he wrote in his sleep, is the most honest image the series ever produced of what the aftermath looks like. Not defeat, not resolution, the evidence of a mind still carrying something it cannot put down, trying to function in the space between what it survived and what it still holds. The question this series has been building toward, through all of its lore and all of its horror, is not about the markers or the moons or the end of human civilization. It is about why we recognize something in Isaac Clarke, why the specific combination of grief and exploitation and the failure of every protective system and the weaponization of love resonates with people who have never been on a spaceship and never encountered an alien artifact. That question belongs in the final section. And the answer, if you have been paying attention to the structure of what we have been building here, is more personal than you might expect. Chapter 8: The Lineage of the Dark. Science fiction has been afraid of space for as long as it has been writing about going there. This is worth acknowledging plainly because there is a version of the science fiction tradition that presents itself as optimistic, starships as symbols of human possibility, the vast dark as a canvas for exploration, the alien as a mirror in which humanity finds its better qualities reflected back. That tradition is real and it produced genuinely great work, but running parallel to it, sometimes inside the same texts, sometimes in conversation with them, is another tradition entirely. The tradition that noticed something the optimists preferred not to dwell on, that noticed the silence out there is very large, that noticed the distance between any two human beings on a ship in deep space and the nearest other human being is a number that the mind, confronted directly, resists believing. Dead Space did not invent the horror of space. It inherited it from a lineage going back decades, drawing from a set of specific predecessors that each contributed one piece of the architecture the franchise would eventually combine. Understanding what Dead Space took from what came before, and what it added, is the clearest way to explain why this particular franchise lodged itself so permanently in the minds of people who played it. Start with Ridley Scott's Alien, because that is where the modern tradition of ship-based science fiction horror essentially begins its most influential form. The Nostromo is not the Ishimura, but they share a blueprint, an industrial vessel, built for extraction rather than exploration, crewed by workers whose relationship to the mission is professional rather than heroic. The ship's aesthetic is not sleek, it is functional, grimy, marked by the accumulated wear of a vehicle that exists to do a job rather than to represent humanity's aspirations. When the crew of the Nostromo respond to what they believe is a distress signal, they are doing so not because of heroism, but because their corporate charter requires them to, and because their employer has interests in what that signal might represent. The institutional betrayal at the heart of Alien is the element that Dead Space recognized and amplified. Weyland-Yutani's instruction to bring back the alien at the expense of the crew is not the action of a corporation that failed, it is the action of a corporation that succeeded at its actual mission, while appearing to fail at its stated one. The crew were always expendable. The alien was always the priority. The fiction of their protection was just that, a fiction maintained only as long as nothing more valuable needed the space they were occupying. Dead Space heard that, and turned the volume up. EarthGov did not simply expose its people to risk for an asset it valued more highly. It built the asset from people's brains while they slept. The betrayal in Alien is institutional indifference. The betrayal in Dead Space is institutional farming. These are related points on a spectrum, but they are not the same point, and the distance between them represents a specific escalation in how horror can think about the relationship between individual human beings and the systems that claim to protect them. Alien also established the biological logic that Dead Space would develop further. The xenomorph is a perfect organism in the specific sense that every element of its biology serves the function of reproduction and survival. It uses human bodies as incubators. It coats surfaces in resin that transforms environments to serve its purposes. The body horror it produces is the horror of the human form being repurposed by something that has no interest in what it was before. Necromorphs extend this logic but alter its emotional register. The xenomorph uses human bodies as vessels for something alien. The necromorphs are human bodies, restructured but not replaced, wearing the remains of people who used to have names and shifts and personal effects stored in their quarters. The horror of the slasher is not that something alien is wearing a human suit. The horror is that the human is still partially visible inside the restructuring. The outline of a person remains beneath the transformation, and that outline is the source of most of the dread. Now move to a film that is less celebrated but more directly relevant, Event Horizon, released in 1997 and largely dismissed on arrival, which has since accumulated the kind of slow reputation that certain horror films develop when enough people notice that something in them reached somewhere other films do not. The premise involves a ship, the Event Horizon, that was designed to travel through a dimension of pure chaos, and return from that dimension with something of that dimension still inside it. The specific mechanism is less important than what it does to the crew of the rescue vessel sent to investigate. The ship reads them, it reaches into their psychological histories, and finds the specific memories and relationships that carry the most damage, and it uses those as weapons. The captain of the rescue vessel is shown visions of his dead son, a boy whose death he carries guilt about. The visions are designed to break him. This is the closest any science fiction film came to the marker's operating principle before Dead Space. The grief mechanism, the specifically targeted psychological attack, the use of a dead loved one as the delivery vehicle for something harmful. Event Horizon was already there. What Dead Space added to this was purpose. The haunted ship in Event Horizon is operating on something closer to instinct, a chaos principle that generates harm without agenda. Solaris is the third piece of this lineage and the most intellectually demanding. The alien ocean covering the planet Solaris reads human minds and manifests physical reproductions of significant people from those minds, drawn from memories and grief. The protagonist encounters a reproduction of his dead wife, a woman whose death he has never fully processed. The crucial insight Solaris offered is that the alien doing this has no malevolent intent. The ocean is not trying to harm the people it affects. It is attempting to communicate or simply reflecting what it finds, using the only language it has access to, the deep psychological content of human consciousness. The horror of Solaris is therefore not the horror of being attacked. It is the horror of being understood too completely by something that cannot distinguish between understanding and harm. Dead Space took this mechanism and added the one element Lem's alien lacked: agenda. The marker reads human consciousness for the same reason Solaris's ocean does. It has perfect access to the deep psychological content of anyone within its signal range. But the marker uses that access in service of a specific goal. The hallucination of Nicole is not a communication attempt. It is a guidance system dressed in the face of grief. The marker did not simply find Isaac's wound and reflect it back at him. It found his wound and built a road through it. Then there is the element that Dead Space inherited from the tradition Lovecraft established. The cosmic horror that arrives when a civilization discovers that the universe is much older, much larger, and much less interested in human experience than any theology or philosophy had prepared it for. At the Mountains of Madness, the most significant of Lovecraft's long-form works, sends an Antarctic expedition into contact with the ruins of an alien civilization of enormous antiquity. The horror is partly the alienness of what they find, and partly the realization of scale. That the things which built those ruins regarded human beings the way human beings regard bacteria, without malice, without interest, simply without awareness. The Brethren moons are Lovecraftian in scale. The geological time frame, the scope of the civilizational consumption they represent, the complete incommensurability between their existence and anything a human moral framework can process, all of this lands in the tradition Lovecraft established. Dead Space earns its place in that tradition honestly, but here is the place where Dead Space departs from Lovecraft in a way that matters. Lovecraftian horror is organized around indifference. The universe does not notice you. The cosmic entities do not register your presence. The terror is the terror of smallness, of irrelevance, of a consciousness so isolated that not even the vast dark cares enough to acknowledge it. This is profound and genuine horror, and it has influenced a century of science fiction thinking. The Brethren moons are not indifferent. They are watching. The signal they broadcast across millions of years was specifically designed to reach minds with enough cognitive complexity to understand it and act on it. The black marker's influence on human evolution was not accidental. It was investment. The moons cultivated humanity over geological time the way a patient farmer cultivates a crop. Every expansion of human civilization, every advancement that extended humanity's reach into the galaxy, every marker recovered and studied and replicated and spread, all of it was tended, encouraged, designed to reach a specific yield. The specific revision Dead Space makes to Lovecraftian horror is to replace indifference with attentiveness. The universe does not ignore you. The universe has been watching you since before you existed, nurturing you toward a specific state of readiness. That is not the horror of being too small to matter. That is the horror of mattering in a way you were never informed of, to something you never consented to serve. This distinction has a name in trauma literature. The specific damage done by a predatory relationship is different from the damage done by a natural disaster. Both can destroy the same person. Both can produce the same external signs of damage, but the internal mechanism differs in one precise way. The predatory relationship requires that the person mattered to the predator, required attention, required being known well enough to be used effectively. Lovecraftian horror produces the damage of meaninglessness. Dead Space's brand of cosmic horror produces the damage of having been meaningful in exactly the wrong way. No other franchise in science fiction horror had made this move cleanly before Dead Space did it. Aliens want bodies for reproduction and use whoever is available. Solaris's ocean reflects without agenda. Event Horizon's haunted dimension creates chaos without direction. Lovecraft's entities ignore you. The markers were built to find you specifically, learn what you love specifically, and use that love specifically to move you toward completing what they need. There is one additional piece of the lineage worth naming. John Carpenter's The Thing, set in Antarctic isolation rather than space, offered science fiction horror's most rigorous exploration of what happens to human social trust when the category of the human becomes unreliable. The creature in that film is not simply dangerous, it is a perfect mimic, indistinguishable from the human beings it replaces until specific conditions reveal the substitution. The horror it produces is the horror of looking at the person beside you and genuinely being unable to confirm whether what you are looking at is still that person. Dead Space translates this into a grief context. The question the franchise is always asking is not whether the creature is really the person. The question is whether the love you feel for the memory of the person is grounds for believing the thing in front of you is them. The thing asks whether you can trust your eyes. Dead Space asks whether you can trust your heart. These are related questions, but the second is considerably harder to answer. What Dead Space ultimately did with this lineage was synthesize it. The ship as trap from Alien, the grief as weapon mechanism from Solaris and Event Horizon, the ancient artifact guiding evolution from the tradition that runs through 2001's Monolith and into the Black Marker, the cosmic attentiveness that revised Lovecraft's Indifference, the trust breakdown that the thing had mapped in a different register. All of these elements were assembled into a single coherent mythology, and the result was a franchise whose horror operated on more simultaneous levels than any of its predecessors had managed. The reason that synthesis produced something greater than the sum of its parts is simple. Each of those predecessor traditions was addressing a specific human fear in isolation. The fear of institutional betrayal, the fear of grief, the fear of cosmic irrelevance, the fear of being unable to trust the people beside you. Dead Space addressed all of them through the same mechanism. The marker is the institutional betrayal, built and studied by organizations that sacrifice the people inside them. The marker is the grief weapon, using the dead faces of people you loved. The marker is the cosmic horror, a signal from something that predates human civilization and will outlast it. The marker is the trust breakdown, because the most untrustworthy voice in the franchise is the one that sounds most like love. A horror that can reach you through any of those channels is a horror with no safe approach. There is no angle from which you are protected. The psychological, the institutional, the cosmic, the intimate, all of them lead to the same place. That place is the Ishimura's dark corridors, and the thing at the end of them wearing a face you recognize. Chapter 9. Why This Still Terrifies. If you have stayed with this story all the way to this point, there is something you should know about yourself. You did not stay because the necromorphs are interesting, though they are. You did not stay because the lore of the Brethren Moons is a compelling piece of science fiction mythology, though it is that as well. You stayed because something in the architecture of this story recognized you, not as a person who has been on a haunted spaceship, as a person who has been alone in the dark with something that uses the faces of people you love to tell you what to do. That recognition is not metaphorical, it is biological, and understanding why Dead Space produces the specific texture of dread it produces, the kind that does not dissipate when the lights come on, that resurfaces at unexpected moments, that settles into the back of the mind and stays there, requires going somewhere the game itself never explicitly goes. It requires looking at what real isolation actually does to the brain, what grief actually looks like at the neurological level, and why the specific combination of those two things is the most effective horror delivery mechanism ever designed, whether the designer was a game studio or an alien artifact that has been testing variations of this approach on intelligent civilizations for millions of years. Begin with isolation, because it is the environment everything else in Dead Space operates within. In the 1950s and early 1960s, a Canadian psychologist named John Lilly and researchers working independently at McGill University conducted a series of experiments on what happens to human consciousness when it is systematically deprived of external sensory input. The methodology varied, but the core question was consistent. What does the mind do when it cannot receive information from the world outside itself? Subjects were floated in tanks of water maintained at body temperature, wearing blackout goggles, in soundproofed rooms. Some wore gloves and padded limb coverings to eliminate tactile feedback. The goal was to reduce the incoming signal from the external world to as close to zero as possible. What happened was not what the researchers expected. They had anticipated that the deprived brain would simply rest, that without the constant work of processing external sensory information, consciousness would settle into something calmer, perhaps more reflective, perhaps closer to the meditative states that certain contemplative traditions describe as desirable. Some subjects reported this, particularly in the early stages, but extended sensory deprivation, hours rather than minutes, produced something different. The brain, denied its normal supply of external information, did not reduce its activity. It maintained it by generating information internally. Hallucinations began, not dramatic and cinematic visions, but sensory experiences that were, for the duration of their occurrence, indistinguishable to the subject from genuine external perception. Voices, faces, physical sensations. The subjects were not dreaming, they were awake. In tanks, experiencing a manufactured reality their own neurology was producing, because the alternative, no reality at all, was apparently not something the brain was capable of tolerating. The specific content of these hallucinations was not random. The mind, under sensory deprivation, pulled from its deepest stores the most emotionally significant people and experiences in the subject's psychological archive, the memories and relationships that carried the greatest weight, the unresolved material that occupied the most neural real estate. Researchers documented subjects hallucinating deceased family members, engaging in conversations with people who had died years earlier, experiencing vivid replays of significant emotional events from their pasts. The Ishimura is a sensory deprivation tank with necromorphs. Consider the sensory environment Isaac inhabits: the darkness of space through every porthole and breach, the near silence of vacuum in the sections where the hull has failed, the claustrophobia of corridors designed for industrial work rather than human comfort, the complete absence of any other living human for extended periods, his suit systems mediating his physical experience of the environment, temperature, pressure, the tactile world. Through layers of technology that replace direct sensory contact with processed data, he is, in a very specific sense, floating in a sensory deprivation environment of planetary scale. His brain receiving exactly the conditions under which the research subjects in those 1960s tanks began generating their own reality from stored emotional material. The hallucination of Nicole does not require the marker to explain it. The marker amplifies and directs it, gives it specific content and specific purposes, uses it as a guidance mechanism rather than allowing it to be the free-floating grief response it would have been in different circumstances. But the raw material, the brain's tendency to manufacture the presence of a lost loved one when deprived of other sensory grounding, is the mechanism the marker found already operational in Isaac's neurology and decided to use. This is why Isaac specifically, among all the crew members who survived the initial outbreak, was the marker's preferred instrument. The other survivors had their own hallucinations, their own points of psychological vulnerability. But Isaac's combination of factors produced something uniquely receptive: the specific nature of his loss, a relationship interrupted rather than concluded, a wound with no available closure, created an unresolved activation pattern in his grief architecture that the marker signal could access with exceptional efficiency. His grief was not static, it was dynamic, still actively searching for resolution, still generating the kind of brain activity around Nicole's memory that made a hallucination of her both easy to produce and easy for Isaac to believe. There is a term in complicated grief research: the searching behavior. People who have lost someone significant, particularly in sudden or violent circumstances, or in circumstances that left important things unresolved, frequently experience an extended period in which the brain continues producing behavior organized around finding the lost person. This is not irrational. It is the grief system doing exactly what it was designed to do, applying the normal mechanisms for resolving absence, looking, calling, seeking, expecting the return, to an absence that cannot be resolved. The searching behavior persists because the grief architecture has not yet received the signal that the search is permanently futile. Isaac's brain was still in searching behavior when he boarded the Ishimura. He was still actively looking for Nicole, still organized around the possibility of reaching her. The marker did not create that orientation. It met it, it gave the searching behavior a destination. A voice, a face that moved and spoke and provided exactly the sense of partial contact that searching behavior is organized to respond to. The result was that Isaac could not stop following the hallucination, even when part of him understood what it was. This is documented in the game's progression, in the notes and logs that accumulate around his psychological state. Rational assessment told him, at various points, that something was wrong with what he was experiencing. The thing wearing Nicole's face said things Nicole would not have said. It appeared in places where Nicole could not have been. The internal inconsistencies accumulated, but the searching behavior, the grief architecture, the biological drive to close the open loop, these overrode the rational assessment every time because grief operates through older and more urgent systems than the prefrontal cortex that handles logical evaluation. This is the most honest thing Dead Space says about grief. It says that grief is not simply sadness. It is a biological operating system with its own drives and its own override capabilities. And when it is organized around an unresolved loss, it can be used by anything that knows how to speak to it in the right language. The marker speaks grief fluently. It has had, if the Brethren Moon hypothesis is correct, millions of years of practice with whatever species it has previously processed. Every intelligent civilization that has ever been consumed by a convergence event before humanity had its own version of loss, its own version of the people it loved and could not let go of. The marker's ability to identify and exploit grief is not an accident of its design. It is the primary feature. The faces it shows to the people it needs to move are not chosen randomly. They are the results of a deep scan of what matters most to the specific mind it needs to use, what wound is deepest, what loss is least resolved. There is a concept in betrayal trauma theory developed by psychologist Jennifer Freyd that distinguishes between different kinds of harm based on their source. The basic insight is this: harm inflicted by a stranger, though it may be violent and physically devastating, does not produce the same psychological damage as harm inflicted by a trusted source. When the person or institution that hurts you is one you depended on, one whose protection you believed in, one whose guidance you had organized your behavior around, the damage goes deeper, into layers of the psychological architecture that ordinary violence cannot reach. The specific injury is not to the self in isolation. It is to the model of the world that included the betraying party as a protective element. Betrayal trauma attacks your ability to trust the categories you relied on to stay safe. If a stranger can hurt you, you update your model of strangers. If a parent can hurt you, you update your model of what parents are. If the government, whose protection you assumed, can secretly farm your brain for alien construction blueprints while you sleep in a straitjacket, you update your model of what governments do with the people inside their care. Isaac Clarke experiences betrayal trauma from every direction the series offers. His mother, the first model of protective love, was taken by unitology and converted into something that destroyed the family. Nicole, who represented the possibility of a relationship that could hold his grief, was taken by the Ishimura and converted, through the marker's manipulation, into the hallucination that guided him toward reassembling the marker. EarthGov, the institutional authority that theoretically existed to protect its citizens, treated him as a resource to be harvested while he was sedated and helpless. The medical infrastructure that presented itself as treatment was a cover for systematic exploitation. Even the distress signal that brought him to the Ishimura, the mechanism that should represent the legitimate function of emergency communication, the way isolated people call for help and receive it, had been sent by Nicole herself, whose final message was recorded in the grip of a marker-induced collapse. Every system that should have worked, every relationship that should have protected him, every institutional structure that should have maintained its stated purpose of serving, rather than exploiting the people inside it, all of it had been converted, at various levels of deliberateness, into a mechanism pointing toward the same outcome. Not his death, his use. Dead Space works as horror because it takes the structures we use to survive and shows what they look like when they fail in specific, targeted ways. The structures that protect human beings from the worst experiences of existence are not random. They have been built, over the course of human development, in response to specific needs, the need for connection to ward off isolation, the need for grief processes that move toward resolution, the need for institutional frameworks that direct collective behavior toward outcomes that serve the people inside them. These structures are not perfect. They fail regularly and in well-documented ways, but they are genuinely what stands between an individual human being and the full weight of a universe that does not, in the absence of those structures, organize itself around any particular person's survival. The marker's specific attack on all of these structures simultaneously is what makes Dead Space's horror feel different from other kinds of horror. Most horror takes one structure and breaks it. The haunted house removes the safety of home. The monster removes the safety of the body. The psychological horror of something like Outlast removes the safety of the institution. Dead Space removes all of them in sequence, stripping each protective layer in turn until there is nothing left between Isaac and the full implication of what the universe contains, and then it asks him to keep going anyway. The specific quality of what Isaac does, not heroism exactly, not in any clean sense of the word, is the quality of continuing to function when every support system has been dismantled. There is a concept in trauma-informed psychology, sometimes called post-traumatic growth, which describes the capacity of some individuals, after catastrophic experiences, to develop resources and strengths that were not present or accessible before. This is not the same as recovery. Recovery implies a return to a previous state. Post-traumatic growth acknowledges that the previous state is gone permanently, and that what the survivor builds in its place is something new, constructed from the material of the catastrophe itself. Isaac's continued survival is not recovery. His mind was written on by the marker. His parents are gone, taken by a church built on a murder. Nicole is gone, and the hallucination that wore her face for 2 games was the last long conversation he was able to have with her memory. 3 years of his life were taken by an institution that had the legal authority to call what it was doing medical treatment. Everything he knew about the universe turned out to be the intended product of a civilizational scale manipulation that predates the existence of humanity, and he is still there, still moving, still refusing to complete what the thing with Nicole's face is asking him to complete. That refusal, not heroic defiance of a villain, not a triumphant stand against evil, but the specific act of a psychologically devastated person saying no to the thing using the face of someone they loved, is the emotional center of Dead Space. Everything else in the franchise, all the lore and the markers and the necromorphs and the institutional corruption and the cosmic horror, serves as the delivery mechanism for that one moment. The moment when Isaac, in the ruins of his own grief, looked at the hallucination of Nicole and said, "You are not her." The reason that moment lands the way it does is that it asks something real of the player and the listener alike. Have you ever had to stop believing in something that wore the face of love? Have you ever had to recognize that the thing guiding you was not actually the person you thought it was? That the voice saying "trust me" was not coming from a trustworthy source? That the grief keeping you following was being used by something that had no interest in your well-being? The marker is specific to the Dead Space universe. The mechanism is not. The hallucination wearing someone's face is the story of every cult that has ever used its members' need for community to extract compliance with things those members would never otherwise accept. It is the story of every institution that has ever framed its exploitation of vulnerable people as being for those people's benefit. It is the story of every relationship where love was used as leverage, where the face of someone who mattered was put in front of a door that should not have been opened. Dead Space is not a metaphor for any of these things. It is a horror story about an alien artifact that destroys civilizations. But horror works, the specific kind that lodges in the mind and does not leave, when its mechanisms are real mechanisms. When the fear it produces is not fear of something that cannot happen, but recognition of something that does. Think about where you are in the dark right now, listening to this. Think about whatever version of isolation is most familiar to you, not the extreme version, not the Ishimura version, but your own. The specific quality of being in a room alone, late at night, with thoughts that won't stay quiet, with the faces and voices of people who are absent from your life for whatever reason, with the unresolved conversations that replay themselves with variations, testing different endings, looking for the one that finally closes the loop, the searching behavior that does not stop just because you have decided it should. The thing that makes Dead Space terrifying is the thing that makes it true. The marker is a science fiction artifact, but the process it represents, the weaponization of grief, the use of love as a delivery mechanism for harm, the specific vulnerability of the mind that cannot complete its mourning, is not fiction at all. It is the oldest and most consistent form of psychological exploitation in human experience, present in every culture and every time period, documented by every branch of psychology that studies how people are manipulated. The Ishimura's dark corridors are a dramatic setting for something that happens in lit rooms. The necromorphs are a dramatic visualization of what it looks like when the dead will not stay where they belong, when grief and loss are refused resolution and keep returning in altered forms, demanding attention through escalating disruption. The marker is the dramatic name for the signal that any unresolved wound broadcasts. The one that says, "Come here, use this, follow the face you recognize, complete the task, make us whole." Isaac Clarke's survival, fractured, permanent damage survival, the kind that leaves marker symbols on apartment walls and drives a man into hiding on a lunar colony, is the most honest portrayal of what it looks like to remain in the aftermath of all of this. Not healed, not recovered, permanently changed in ways that cannot be undone, but still refusing to finish what the thing wearing Nicole's face needed him to finish. Still himself, barely, but still. There is one final thing worth holding as this analysis closes. It is not a comfort, exactly, but it is the thing Dead Space offers in place of comfort. Isaac Clarke, in the arc of the series, moves through experiences that would be described in any clinical framework as catastrophic trauma, multiple distinct catastrophic trauma events, in fact, stacked end to end with no adequate recovery time between them. He arrives at the end of that progression with a mind that is permanently different from the one he started with, carrying imprints he did not consent to and cannot fully remove. But the knowledge he carries, the complete understanding of what the markers are and what the Brethren Moons want, and what humanity has been building toward since the black marker fell into a crater 65 million years ago, is knowledge that no one else in the human story possesses as completely as he does. He is the only person who has followed the full thread from the Ishimura's dark corridors to the frozen surface of Tau Volantis and assembled the whole picture. He is the only person who has faced the thing wearing Nicole's face and refused to comply with it not once but twice. He is the only person whose mind contains both the marker's architecture and the specific refusal of what that architecture requires. The permanence of that damage and the permanence of that knowledge are the same thing. He was broken by what he knows. He knows it because he survived being broken by it. These are not separate facts. They are one fact expressed in two directions. That is not a simple thing. It does not make the suffering worthwhile in any clean accounting. It does not mean the institutions that harmed him were not monstrous. It does not mean the grief was not real, or the losses were not devastating, or the manipulation was not an unforgivable violation of the most intimate parts of his psychology. But it means that what the marker produced in him was not only what the marker intended to produce. The person the marker needed was a specific kind of broken. What Isaac actually became through all of it was something the marker could not fully predict or fully use, something that, in the end, said no. Keep that with you in whatever dark you are sitting in tonight.